This thing is up in the sky.
China's high-altitude balloon.
We know that they were looking to surveil strategic sites, to include some of our strategic bases in the continental United States.
And as we know, China and the US haven't exactly been getting along lately.
I don't think China's going to risk its national interest for the sake of Mr. Putin's regime.
We have excellent relations with China and excellent relations with India.
There is a lot of trade between Russia and China right now, and it's increasing.
And we are interested in these two great nations to be friends. And we're trying to be helpful.
There seems to be an undercurrent of thinking that we could force a regime change on China. I mean, this kind of thing is just, it's not realistic, it's not in our interest, and it's not going to lead us to a good place in the end.
This is Global Insights by Network 2020, and the very first episode of our Deep Dives China series, where we will seek to understand China's objectives at home and abroad. Tensions between the United States and China have escalated, but is there still hope for cooperation in the current political climate? What are the potential consequences of a deteriorating relationship between the two nations? And are they worth it? Joining us today is Susan Thornton, Senior Fellow at Yale Law School's Paul Tsai China Center with a distinguished 28-year career at the Department of State. As former acting Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, she is widely recognized for her leadership in U.S. China relations, including the North Korean pressure campaign and development of the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy. Moderating the discussion is Courtney Doggart, President of Network 2020.
So Susan, welcome back to Network 2020. It's nice to see you again.
Thanks.
Thank you. Kicking us off today. So the U.S. China relationship has been in the news a lot recently. How would you characterize the recent developments that you're seeing and their immediate impact on U.S. China relations?
Well, thanks, Courtney. I mean, it's really important, I think, that we have this discussion today and we think hard and deeply, as in your deep dive series, about the U.S. relationship with China, where we are at the moment and where we're going. I guess in the first instance, we should talk about where we are so that we can all level set where we're starting from. So, the last couple of months have been pretty eventful. In November, President Biden was able to finally sit down with President Xi Jinping of China in Bali, Indonesia, on the margins of the G20 Leaders Summit. That was the first time that the two leaders had been able to meet in person, although they'd had a couple of phone calls before that. This meeting was supposed to be a way of restabilizing U.S.-China ties. There were a number of things that were put forward on both sides, and there were fairly positive statements coming out from that meeting about the intention to try to find a floor in the relationship so that the relations wouldn't keep spiraling downward and become even more fraught and dangerous. And one of the biggest outcomes from that meeting was that Tony Blinken was supposed to go to China for a visit, his first visit as Secretary of State to China, and the first visit by a Secretary of State from the U.S. to China in 5 years. But unfortunately, as many of us probably have become aware, the appearance of this giant spy balloon, as it's been called, over the northern part of the United States, and the ensuing kind of reactions to that, both sort of political reactions, but also military reactions. The shooting down of the balloon over the ocean off South Carolina, the ensuing fracas between the U.S. and China, really has now kind of, as one small incident that will probably not be remembered in the annals of history, really sabotaged kind of any attempts that were going to be made to put things on a more stable track. Tony Blinken canceled his visit to China. The Chinese sort of made a lot of statements about the U.S. overreaction to the spy balloon business. The U.S. put forward demands about, China must promise never to send any more balloons over the United States. And Tony Blinken and his counterpart, or one of his counterparts, Wang Yi, met on the margins of a meeting in Germany, which was a very acrimonious meeting, and basically came to no meeting of the minds. In fact, there in Munich, there were more mutual recriminations over potential Chinese support to Russia in its war on Ukraine, the U.S. publicly warning China, which is fairly unprecedented, warning China not to sell or deliver any lethal assistance to Russia. Chinese maintain they're not doing that, etc. So things have really deteriorated in the last couple of months, and there doesn't seem to be any plan for any diplomacy with China on the horizon on the part of the United States, at least bilateral meetings. And I would say that, even the top level now communication between the two presidents has been put in jeopardy. There was this very odd moment in Biden's State of the Union address where he almost taunted Xi Jinping by name in the speech, saying, what world leader would want to change places with Xi Jinping? Name me one, name me one. This did not go down well in Beijing. And now we've seen in recent days, Xi Jinping has named the U.S. In a public speech as the leader of a containment strategy to block China's economic development, which doesn't sound like much to an American ear, given the discourse and rhetoric in this country, but for Chinese to name a country or a leader is very unusual and significant. So at the moment, we hear that maybe Biden wants to make a phone call to Xi Jinping. We also hear that Chinese aren't very excited to talk to President Biden at the moment. And this means basically that, all communication in an official way has been interrupted, and there's no clear way of getting it back on track at this point.
As follow-up, you've been a diplomat for decades. You know China very, very well. If you could just help explain to our audience, on the one hand, we had this what looked like some positive steps in a direction in November, and then on the other hand, you had the spy balloon incident, and the concern over arms sales to Russia. Is diplomacy predicated on trust, or is there something else going on here? Because for people observing, they might just say, well, we can't move forward in a positive relationship if we don't have trust. And it seems like that trust wasn't there, of China saying one thing and then doing another. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I think what most people would say about diplomacy between major powers is that, you can't really base it on so-called trust. And I mean, there's different ideas maybe of what that word means, but basically there has to be a certain amount of credibility that what you're saying means something. And I think at the moment between the U.S. and China, China believes that what the U.S. says doesn't mean anything in terms of the actions they see coming from the U.S. They think there's a huge disconnect between what, for example, President Biden said in Bali, and then what subsequent actions the US has been taking with respect to China. And on the other hand, I think the US views China the same way. We see China saying, we're not going to deliver lethal assistance to Russia. And then we see what we think are indications that maybe China is actually thinking about doing that. So, this is the game that's being played. And I mean, in other times, earlier times when we've been, in diplomatic conversations with the Chinese quite intensively, you don't get these deltas because you have an ongoing conversation about what you're doing. It's much clearer to each side what the intentions of the other side is, because they are talking to lots of people and they're working on making progress on certain issues. And I think the absence of communication has really fostered this kind of climate of, I mean, it's not even mistrust or skepticism, it's downright kind of disbelief in anything the other side says.
Thank you. Thanks for that clarification. You are an advocate of cooperation with China. So how do you respond to those like John Mearsheimer, for example, who argue that it was this policy of engagement over the years that led to China's rise in this ensuing period of dangerous tension?
Well, I mean, John Mearsheimer and other kind of international relations theorists have written a lot about, U.S. China relations. Of course, he's also quite famously written a lot about U.S. Russia relations and the Ukraine war. And, I've taken issue with Mearsheimer's analysis, in public, in foreign affairs, and at various, venues where I've been on panels with him. And basically, I've been working as a actual participant in diplomacy, and seeing kind of the realities and the hard work that goes in, the sort of shoe leather stuff that we do to try to make progress on issues with diplomatic partners, but also in various international settings, multilateral settings, et cetera. Mearsheimer sees the world in quite, I would say, black and white terms. I see a lot of shades of gray. He, would say that the international system is marked by sort of anarchy, and each country trying to maximize their power in the system in order to pursue their national interests. He would say that probably war between the US and China, or some kind of major conflict, is inevitable because of the inevitable clash of sort of a rising power with a status quo power. These are things that Graham Allison at Harvard has also written about, although I think Graham Allison tries to make the case that there's less inevitability there. I see the potential for a conflict as being radically avoidable, I guess, and I hope it will be avoided. And I think there's a lot in diplomacy and international relations and international institutions, processes, habits of cooperation that we can lean on to try to, foster a more balanced approach to international affairs that would be more beneficial to the United States over the long run. I've seen this work in practice. I've been in diplomacy with China where we have made progress on all kinds of issues. It takes a long time. It's not easy. Their system does not match up well with ours. But I think the notion that a lot of people now have in the US political elite that somehow we can have an approach that will systematically weaken China, or maybe even, as you hear when you listen to things like the House Select Committee on Strategic Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party, there seems to be an undercurrent of thinking that we could force a regime change on China. I mean, this kind of thing is just, it's not realistic. It's not in our interest, and it's not going to lead us to a good place in the end.
So are there areas that you see of potential cooperation in this climate? Anything, whether it's maybe not done directly by governments, but track 2 or something. Do you see areas for potential cooperation right now?
I think that as the leader of the so-called containment policy toward China, and I do believe that that is what the U.S. is prosecuting. And if you hear U.S. government officials talk about it, that is precisely what they're saying. I don't think as the leader of that policy that there's going to be a lot of room for bilateral discussion or cooperation between the U.S. and China, because basically the U.S. has marked out China as an adversary, and we're prosecuting a kind of Cold War type policy to isolate and contain them. And I don't think the Chinese are going to be convinced to engage with us on that basis, frankly. But I do think there are a lot of areas where we will cooperate with China in multilateral fora, and you've seen this happen recently. There was a negotiation over a UN treaty on the high seas where U.S. and Chinese delegates, both worked together, or maybe separately, but in parallel, to get that treaty across the finish line recently. There are a lot of efforts like that that are parallel in various areas. I would say probably climate change at this point, there's no real bilateral discussion on climate change between the U.S. and China at the moment, but nevertheless, we'll still end up meeting in multilateral venues, surrounding the Paris Climate Accords, and we'll be hopefully working, each of us, toward making progress on those issues in our parallel tracks. And of course, then there's the obvious area of commercial cooperation and trade. I mean, last year, U.S. China trade hit a new record high. So in spite of all of the sanctions and recriminations and spy balloons and other negative things happening with tensions in the Taiwan Strait, we still managed to keep commercial relations going. And that's an area I would say to watch carefully, because there are a lot of efforts ongoing with respect to I would say targeted decoupling, but it's hard to know how far they'll go and how they'll be limited. So I think that's an important area to watch. And I would say there's a lot going on too with other countries. We shouldn't forget about that, right? You mentioned in your opening that China brokered. I mean, I think this is quite significant and very surprising, actually, that China brokered this agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which will have, if it works, if it's durable, it will have the effect of bringing more stability to the Middle East, which is, of course, in the United States' interest and in the interests of everyone. And China has not typically gotten involved in brokering these kinds of peace agreements between countries that are sort of far from their own borders. And so if this is a new trend, that China will get more involved in sort of managing the global system, that is in fact what we had sought in the early part of this century in our relations with China, to get them to step up and do more in these kinds of areas. And that was contained in the sentiment that was put out by Robert Zoellick under the George W. Bush administration about, we want China to become a responsible stakeholder. There was the sense then that China was a sort of a free rider on the international system, and we want them to, be in the international system, but also strengthen and support the international system more. And so now that they're doing it, of course, I think we were not super enthusiastic in our reception for this recent agreement, but and there's a lot of talk about China replacing the US's influence in the Middle East, et cetera. But I think pretty much any way you look at this agreement, it's a good thing. So I'm not so happy with the US being so ungenerous in its responses to some of these unalterably sort of good things that happen. But and I don't think that's a good look for US diplomacy, frankly. I don't think it helps our influence in the Middle East to be sort of negative about this agreement. But I think you'll see China doing more of these kinds of things that don't involve the United States, that they can step out on their own and do more on the diplomatic stage.
Thank you. Yes, you just mentioned the international system, so I'd love to stay on that point for a little bit. I mean, obviously, the U.S.-China relationship does not happen in a vacuum. What impact does the dynamic between the United States and China have on the international system and multilateral diplomacy? And conversely, how do you see international systems and bilateral relationships impacting the contours of the U.S.-China dynamic?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important for your listeners to sort of think about this important question because, the international system has been in flux over basically my career. I grew up in a bipolar system during the Cold War, the standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union. And of course, it was then that Nixon made the opening to China in order to basically bring China in on our side against the Soviet Union. And no one disputes, I don't think at this point, that was a very good strategy and a positive one for the United States and paid big dividends. Then after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, we moved to a unipolar international system where the US was such an outsized power that it could basically do what it wanted. There were very few constraints on US power after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Of course, during the Cold War, there were constraints. We had all these arms control agreements. People talk about them now in the context of China, but these were constraints on US power. And other kinds of arrangements that we had in this bipolar system that assured that we wouldn't hopefully, mutually destroy one another, right? But in the 90s, we moved to this unipolar system. The US was the undisputed pole in the system. And, we saw over the course of 3 decades, kind of that unconstrained power at work in the system. So we saw the proliferation of kind of wars of choice, if you will, unilateral kinds of moves on the part of the United States in terms of sanctions and other things proliferating. Of course, we prosecuted the Great War on Terror and wars in Iraq and Afghanistan during that time. And now I think part of what we see in the US response to China is a function of the realization, maybe not explicitly stated in the US, that the world is moving into a new stage. And many academics and people in other countries talk about this post-Cold War world and post-Cold War international system and the move to a more multipolar system. Which is definitely happening. And it's something that I think US politicians are having a very hard time grappling with, because it means, obviously, that the US unconstrained power and unipolar system is transitioning to something where the United States is going to have less power in that system. And that is a very hard thing for politicians to coin a narrative for that seems positive in our democratic system. So, I think this is very difficult for us to do. I think China, could have played this a lot smarter. When I was in Beijing in the embassy in the early 2000s, there was a prominent academic who was an advisor to then President Hu Jintao, who coined the phrase China's peaceful rise. Now, there was a lot of derision around it from Americans at the time saying, haha, China's not peaceful. But the idea behind the slogan was that there was a realization that China's rise was going to be seen as threatening, particularly to the US, but probably to other countries in the Asia Pacific region as well, and that China should be humble and careful to, rise in a way that was not going to attract a lot of attention and, fear. And, unfortunately, when Xi Jinping came into power, he really abandoned that sort of notion that China should be more humble, should be careful, and was quite, impatient and aggressive about pursuing China's sort of newfound place in the international system and on the global stage. I probably am more skeptical about efforts by China to export its system and things like that than some other people who see China in a much more threatening light, probably because I spent a lot of time there. I think China faces a lot of challenges. I think we are overestimating the danger from China, but you can see how in this sort of dynamic in moving toward a multipolar system where other countries are also rising and want more say in the system. And here the US has had sort of this, carte blanche to do what it wanted for 30 years. Making this transition is going to be pretty tricky.
All right, I'll try to get in one last question before going to the Q&A. And if you're listening, if you want to ask a question, please put it in the Q&A box and I'll try to get to as many of them as I can. So if you had a magic wand, what would you do? What would your priorities be?
Yeah, this is a really hard question because we're at such a bad place right now in U.S. China relations. The most important thing, and people talk about it in the Biden administration and even in Congress, although I'm not sure in Congress they really mean it, but the most important thing is to avoid a war with China, obviously, because it would be catastrophic, not just for China, but for the US and for the rest of the world, and certainly all the countries in the region. And everybody wants to avoid this. The most important and most likely place, and maybe the only, actually, the only likely place for a conflict between the United States and China is over Taiwan. And we haven't talked much about that, but if I could wave a magic wand and do one thing, it would be to try to fix or take down the level of provocative, unnecessary kind of interactions that are happening right now in the Taiwan Strait, both coming from the US, but also coming from China. And the way I think we would have to do that would be probably politically impossible in the United States, but we would have to try to ratchet back some of the more adventurous kinds of actions that we're taking under our approach to Taiwan and move back into the framework of a one China policy that we've had since Nixon's visit to China and since Henry Kissinger negotiated the Shanghai Communique with the Chinese. I think it would be very hard to do now because we've gone pretty far beyond it. But I think people in the United States really don't understand how provocative, how threatening what we're doing right now with respect to Taiwan is seen in China. And I think this is really important to have people understand in the context of the current, war in Ukraine and how we got there. Obviously, this is something that is just incomprehensible how Russia could invade Ukraine and bomb it so brutally. And, there's no excuse for Vladimir Putin having done this, but problems with Russia have been building up for such a long time, and people who I think understand Russia's paranoia and security fears let's just say we're not surprised to see that Russia would harbor such extreme feelings about Ukraine. And so, we have to, even if we think they're wrong, we have to appreciate how other countries are looking at their own security situations, and we have to, take their concerns seriously, or we may end up in a situation that we really didn't design and didn't want to be in.
Very good point. I'm turning to the Q&A now, and one of our first questions is, what do you think is the main motivation of U.S. hostility towards China?
Well, I think basically we're afraid. I think we're afraid. We're afraid of losing our primacy in the international system. We're afraid that China is a juggernaut that's on the march and is going to displace a lot of our economic activities. We're afraid that they're building up a modern military that is going to be a challenge to our military and may, as countries develop, I mean, you can say, if you're China, that I'm going to have a peaceful rise, but you have a huge military under arms, you're developing modern weapons, you're getting more powerful, and with increasing power come increasing ambitions. And no one in China can convincingly tell you that they're not going to, move to protect their interests with their military as they perceive them in the future. And that may very well end up being in sort of contradistinction to the interests of the US and our allies in the region. And certainly, I mean, the issue of Taiwan is a huge problem in US China relations. It's always been a huge problem in US China relations, and people, managing the relationship have always been very careful about this issue because they have known it was the one place where we can get into a conflict. Unfortunately, in the last 5 years, I would have to say that the careful management of this issue has been dropped, and we have been using it as a kind of a cudgel, if you will, in the US China relationship, which has deteriorated. And I think this is extremely dangerous for Taiwan, especially, but also for the United States and China and the rest of the world. So that's the one area that I think people should pay most attention to.
Great, thank you. The next question. So the questioner writes, there is an interesting article in Foreign Affairs, the March-April issue by Kishore Mahbubani, that suggests that the US could learn from ASEAN in how to deal with China, and that the US containment policy is a mistake, and that continuously trying to thwart China's desire to be a major actor on the international stage is wrongheaded and counterproductive, I think, as you've outlined. So it sounds like you're familiar with this basic premise, but of the idea of this being counterproductive. What do you think about the piece, how we could learn from ASEAN? So this kind of goes back to what you're saying earlier about, reliance on multilateral and other institutions.
Yeah. I mean, I think the real difference between the way ASEAN views China and the way the US views China is that, first of all, the ASEANs have a much greater familiarity with China, Chinese culture, its system. Many of these countries have huge Chinese populations living in them. And so they have really complicated relations with China, and they see the region as very complex and having shades of gray. I mean, some of the countries in ASEAN are democracies. Some of them, like Vietnam, are run by the Vietnamese Communist Party. Some are, we would call them probably authoritarians. And so they exist in a milieu that is quite, if not comfortable, at least accepting of the reality that there's a, mixture of forces at work and that they have to adapt. And I think the difference really with respect to China is that they understand that China is not going to just give in to US pressure. I mean, I think this is the big mistake that we're making. We appear to have embarked on a policy that is focused on sort of weakening China's influence, weakening its economy, weakening, blocking its development, thinking that China is going to somehow, either the regime will collapse, which I, am quite skeptical about, or that somehow they will back down, give in, etc. I mean, and I think, people who know anything about China, the Chinese government, the Chinese people are just quite skeptical about that premise. We seem to think we can force them to move in a different direction. And, I think it's only making them more determined.
We have a couple of questions about Russia, China. So one person is asking whether China will supply lethal weapons to Russia at any point in the future, sort of what your take is on that. And then someone else just asking, what do you think about the future of Russia-China cooperation in geopolitics?
Yeah, these are really important questions, and there's a lot of different opinions about this. I've lived and worked in Russia, and I've lived and worked in China for a long time, and I've studied their relationship and speak both languages. I think that the prospects for very close Russia-China cooperation are limited, but they certainly share at this point, a common, let's say, enemy in the United States. They see the U.S. as determined to undermine their security and their economy and their country and their leadership. So that gives them a lot of common cause, probably more now than ever before, because they both feel that it's become starkly apparent that this is the case. So that's number one. Number two, they both feel that the international system needs to move away from this unipolar system of unconstrained US power to something where they, the two of them especially probably, but other countries too, have more of a voice and a say in how things function. And that gives them common cause probably more now than ever before, given that they're both facing extremely, dire sanctions. Russia more than China, but China we keep putting more sanctions on every day, it seems. So these are things that they fiercely object to and want to see changed. There are a number of other things about the international system that they both want to see changed. They have quite symbiotic economies. So Russia is a natural resource provider. China is very short of natural resources. China produces a lot of manufactured goods. Russia doesn't. So there is quite a lot of symbiosis there. On the question of providing, and I should mention also they're increasing military cooperation, although I think that has pretty serious limits because in the end, the two really don't trust each other much, and they are kind of rivals on the same very large landmass, and they coexist somewhat uncomfortably next to one another. But they are having increasing military cooperation. You see increased exercises, joint patrols, etc., and sales of Russian equipment to China before this war in Ukraine broke out were also increasing in significance. The Chinese providing lethal weapons to Russia. China doesn't really want to become embroiled in this conflict in Ukraine. They don't want to become embroiled because they're uncomfortable with it. They don't want to become embroiled because they don't want to become embroiled, and this is their usual position on such conflicts. And they also know that, Europe and the US especially, but also others are watching, and it has to do with their credibility in the international system. They do pretend to stand for principles as outlined in the UN Charter, They do oppose violations of, sovereign territory. They supported the U.S. when we threw Iraq out of Kuwait in the 1991 Gulf War. And so they do, like to see themselves as being a responsible actor on the global stage. That said, there is a lot of trade between Russia and China right now, obviously, and it's increasing because Russia has now such limited prospective partners, and China's taking advantage of the market that's now opened up to them that may have not been there before. And I think it will be not surprising if we find in all this trade that there is something that goes from China to Russia. I don't think it'll be because the Chinese government wants to supply Russia with lethal weapons. I think they'll try to avoid that. But that doesn't mean that something won't go there and that we'll find it and that it will become a big issue. That's sort of what I foresee happening.
Great questions. Thank you. We have a question about demographics now, and they're asking, can you address the effect of China's aging, shrinking population, partly the byproduct of the one-child policy, on the country's ambitions for a modern military and increasing global influence?
Yeah, I think this is a really interesting question. I mean, so China's had this one China policy since Deng Xiaoping, in the early 80s. They have now rescinded it, of course, but nobody seemingly in China, at least in the big cities, really wants to have many children. So they're really facing a crunch. I don't know whether that will change going forward, but the thing that analysts sort of cite is the shrinking labor force that they're already seeing. I mean, we saw the first population actual decline in China registered last year. But, this is really kind of a longer term phenomenon. So, you have to think about the things that people say with respect to China in terms of what's short term, what's medium term, and what's long term. And I think this is really a long term issue. I also think that what we should not lose sight of is that China has still a huge population that is not productively employed. And they can get a lot of productivity gains by investing in human capital, so that can make up for some of the shortfall that we see. So we don't know how much that can make up. China also has a lot of plans for displacing human, labor and with automation, with technology. So that also will play out in the future. So I think the point that a lot of people raise is, there will be a lot of resources going into taking care of the elderly population in China. That's true. It's true of a lot of societies. They see Japan next door. They know what that looks like. But I think they are thinking that they can, invest in their remaining underemployed population and invest in technology that will help fill some of that gap. And then long term, we'll just have to see how it plays out. I mean, they're obviously always going to be a populous country. But how it plays out in terms of their economy going forward is interesting. And the military part of this is also important because, of course, there are a lot of only children in the Chinese military. Many sons, only children's sons of many families in China. And the question has often come up whether that's a drag or some kind of obstacle, or whether it figures in the Chinese propensity to move to conflict. I will say that China's sort of mantra in its military strategy, coming from Sun Tzu, its ancient sort of war theoretician, is that the idea should be to win without fighting. And that is something that I think you'll hear most Chinese military theorists talk about. And with respect to Taiwan, I'm sure that that's their strategy, although it doesn't mean that they wouldn't fight if they thought they had to. But I think they would certainly like to avoid having to do so.
We talked a little bit about the rhetoric in the U.S. And we have a question here that's asking, what do you think is the main reason that leads to the change of thinking of most political elites in China, that they're becoming more aggressive and belligerent, considering that China has not been involved in a major war since the 1980s, and they've basically not established many military bases in different parts of the world. So is there a change in thinking in the political elite in China? And if so, what do you think is the reason for that?
It's a really good question and very hard to answer, but I will try. My first comment would be that they shouldn't have changed their thinking. They should have just kept with the old approach of, methodically, meticulously building up their economy, building up their military, but not being aggressive about it. And, eventually over time, that would have been a good strategy. And why get impatient? You're a civilization with thousands of years of history. You're famous for being more patient than certainly the United States, but most other countries. Why did you abandon that? I think really the explanation comes from a couple of things. And most of them have to do with domestic factors in China. So, the Communist Party of China, I think we all know their number one goal is to keep the Communist Party of China in power. And it is something that they are quite paranoid about and worried about. And they're extremely focused on internal domestic stability and unity and the legitimacy of the governance of the Chinese Communist Party and shoring that up at all costs. And so, what are the things that give legitimacy to the Communist Party's rule? An appointed set of, if you want to believe one version, meritocratic kind of bureaucrats to run the country. Another side would say it's kind of political cronyism. But in any case, what gives them legitimacy to run China? It's performance. So they've delivered economic growth. And it's also, I would say, nationalism. And, when things start to falter on the economic growth side, and China's growth has been slowing, they've run into a lot of societal problems. They've run into a lot of entrenched interests that prevent them from being able to deal with these societal problems. Reforms have really run into a roadblock. And, in the face of maybe deteriorating prospects for legitimacy for your party's rule, you think that pumping up nationalism or, responding in a way that's more muscular to outside pressures and provocations is a way to pump up legitimacy in China. And I think it's also important for Americans to recognize that there are things that, the U.S. has done over the years that sort of put more pressure on China. As China's power has been growing, we've been getting gradually more uncomfortable with it. We've been pressuring militarily. We've seen a few crises erupt over things like this over the years. We had a Taiwan Strait crisis in the 90s. We had a bombing of the Yugoslav embassy, the Chinese embassy. We had a spy plane collide with a Chinese fighter jet off the Chinese coast, and there was a lot of nervousness about what that was going to lead to. We've managed to put all these crises somehow eventually behind us, but there are a lot of things that have been building up on Taiwan in particular in the Western Pacific, with China's rising military power and the rising sort of worrying about China's military power on the part of the U.S. military, a lot of interactions between ships and planes in that region. And, all of this, especially since it's so public, because the U.S. tends to publicize everything, causes the Chinese to need to respond publicly, as they've sort of built up this kind of nationalist undercurrent that supports the Chinese Communist Party. So, Xi Jinping comes into power. He says he's going to pursue, Chinese rejuvenation bringing China back to its rightful place in Asia as a global leading power, closer to the center of the global stage, all of this, which is an appeal certainly to, not just nationalists in China, but to everyone in China who knows the history, which is that China was, strong for thousands of years and was the center of civilization, and then was weakened and carved up by outside powers, and is now throwing off that mantle and coming back. Of course, there's a lot of politics involved in this, et cetera, but I think that's the basic explanation for how we got to where we are.
Thank you. Regarding Taiwan, we have a question. What is the U.S. concern over Taiwan's production of microchips? Is it as much as over democracy? What's your take on that?
This is a very important question, and I hope there will be more discussion in, American circles about what is the U.S. interest in Taiwan. Given that, we are on a course, I would say at the moment, for a collision between the U.S. and China over Taiwan, we should really be talking much more prominently in public about what are the U.S. interests in Taiwan. I don't really subscribe to this notion that, Taiwan's production of semiconductors is really the main U.S. interest in supporting Taiwan or defending Taiwan, because really this issue has not been mentioned as, a central theme of our engagement with Taiwan until maybe the last 2 years. And we have had, ever since 1979, legislation on the books that basically obligates us to ensure that Taiwan has sufficient defense capability to defend itself. And so obviously there's been an interest in Taiwan for the United States going all the way back, to the normalization agreement, et cetera. It's been now, 40 years or more since that, almost 45 since the normalization agreement. And obviously, U.S. interests with respect to Taiwan have changed. But I think the basic formula about our interests and why we are so determined to support Taiwan is the same as it was then, which is that, it has to do with U.S. credibility, the U.S. position in Asia. Taiwan is not a treaty ally. We don't have a defense obligation to Taiwan. We were part of the normalization agreement was that we abrogated our mutual defense treaty, or our defense arrangement with Taiwan. We agreed to withdraw U.S. troops from Taiwan. We agreed to pursue what we called then the One China policy, which wasn't completely what China wanted, but it was enough for them to be able to paper over our differences and proceed with normalizing our relations. That difference is at the heart of the problems that we've had over this issue ever since. But one of the things the U.S. promised was to not have official relations with Taiwan, which is where, you see some of the problems recently coming into play. How do you define an official relationship? It wasn't really completely spelled out at the time. The Chinese think they have a reasonable assessment of what official is, and we beg to differ. So that's one problem. But the interest in Taiwan, it has to do with, history. We were, allied with the Republic of China during the Second World War. As a result of the Chinese Civil War, that ally fled basically to Taiwan to hold out as long as possible in the Chinese Civil War. Obviously, the Chinese Communist Party won the Civil War, and they've never gone and tried to reclaim Taiwan. So there we sit with two different governments. there's a long history here, but I think in the end of the day, the idea now about the U.S. interest in Taiwan is that it's a useful chip, I guess, or a piece on a chessboard in our current strategic competition with China. And that is new. I mean, that has been something that the Chinese have worried about over the years, that Taiwan has worried about over the years. But I would say the U.S. really did not see Taiwan as a bargaining chip in sort of a strategic competition with China until recently. It was more that we supported its democracy, its democratic development, which came about in the 90s. And we support it as a vibrant kind of independent, sort of de facto independent entity, but we don't we don't have a defense treaty with it, or we don't have an obligation there. So, I think it's really complicated and it's really important that we think about this. Of course, Japan, which was the former colonial occupier of Taiwan from 1895 to the end of World War II, has a very big interest in Taiwan as well. And of course, Japan is a close ally of the United States. Their Southwest Islands are very close to Taiwan, so they view the Taiwan issue as a security issue. And it's becoming increasingly clear that the US and Japan are no longer necessarily accepting of a peaceful resolution of the Taiwan issue where Taiwan would be recovered somehow by China. And I think that's really a huge change that's happened in the last 5 years.
All right, great, thank you. So, and just a reminder to everyone, we have 15 minutes more because this is a slightly longer session because it's part of our deep dive. So I'm going to try to get in a couple more questions, and we have some good ones here. And thank you to everyone who's putting a Q&A into the Q&A box. So one person's asking, how do you see the prospects for continued scientific, scholarly, and humanitarian / NGO cooperation going forward?
Yeah, I'm quite worried about that. And, it gets back to the question that you asked, Courtney, is sort of what are the prospects for U.S. China cooperation? Because, I see a lot of confusion in U.S. discourse about what are the threats that China poses? What are the reasonable responses? What is the prioritization of problems that China poses? And because everything's being sort of mixed together, and for a lot of times it's political expediency, let's be clear, almost everything related to China is being tarred with this kind of very nationalistic, I would say, brush, and including, unfortunately, things like scientific cooperation, even in like medical research fields, is really feeling a lot of pressure. And this doesn't get discussed enough, but I think it's become so hard for us to, compartmentalize things with respect to China. And I think there's a lot of questions that are now being raised about non-governmental groups, talking to Chinese groups. If you listen to the House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party hearing, I thought it was quite shocking when there were a couple of people who stood up in the hearing room and were protesting, the hearing, saying, and they held up signs saying, China is not our enemy, stop Asian hate. And these were people from an organization that many of us who have been in hearing rooms are familiar with. Their Code Pink, which is a sort of an anti-war protest organization in the US, and they often show up in hearings on Capitol Hill. But after they stood up and protested, General McMaster, who was one of the witnesses at the hearing, said to the hearing room that, oh, these people must have been influenced by the Chinese United Front Work Department. Which was shocking to me because protesting in the United States is one of our constitutional rights. It's quite reasonable and hopefully desirable for people to have different opinions in the United States and to be able to voice them and protest about them if they want to. And so the notion that if you have a different opinion than the one that was being voiced in the hearing room, you must be influenced by the Chinese United Front Work Department is really a dangerous notion, I think. And I was pretty shocked to hear it from General McMaster, actually. But it just shows you the extent to which this has become a kind of a vogue invocation. And I think it's really important for thoughtful people to stand up and say, you know, this is not the way we in America, go about our work. It's not the way we go about our relationships. It's not the way we go about treating our own citizens. And certainly we shouldn't treat people in general with this kind of cavalier, sort of broad brush, anti kind of attitude in my view.
Going back to the international system, we have a question here that the questioner is asking: if tensions between the U.S., in parentheses, Western countries, and China rise concerning democratic principles over Taiwan and supporting Russia in the war in Ukraine, do you think that China could establish a parallel international system? So the way I read this question is, is this rhetoric over democratic principles, is it going to lead to some sort of divide within the international system?
There is a lot of rhetoric in the United States that says that China wants to create its own international system, or to take over the current international system, or to create a parallel international system. There are some indications of China doing that, particularly in areas where they have been pressing for changes, have been rebuffed, and have the wherewithal to go out on their own. So one good example of this is in the development economics area. They created their own international development bank, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, when they could not get increased voting shares in, say, the World Bank or in the Asian Development Bank, which is headed by Japan. They saw a need and they wanted to put money into this area. And so they went ahead and developed a separate institution. The U.S. Opposed it. All of our allies and partners, except for Japan, joined it. And there it is. It's operating now. They also started a sort of a non-multilateral, sort of a bilateral lending program through the Belt and Road Initiative, which has created a lot of concern in the United States. I saw an article recently that the Chinese put out about wanting to multilateralize the Belt and Road Initiative as well. I mean, what this speaks to is that the Chinese have a lot of funding for this kind of thing, and they think it's important. And the US and other developed countries have really gone away from funding infrastructure in recent years. So we've kind of left an open field, and China has filled it, not successfully in my view, because they've invested in a lot of non-productive assets and projects, but some of them have gone well and some countries like them. But that's one area where they've gone about sort of trying to create their own thing. I would say, though, in general, their rhetoric has been pretty consistent that they want an international system centered on the UN Charter and UN principles, and that's the system that they are going to support and try to bring to fruition. They feel that it's not being implemented, in part because of this sort of unipolar phenomenon that I talked about earlier, and they want to see it implemented in a way that that they find would be more compatible with their interests or with the interests of the developing world. And they don't like parts of it. They are not members of the International Criminal Court, probably for the same reasons that we are not members of the International Criminal Court. But they don't like other countries interfering in the jurisdiction of China with respect to how they want to govern themselves. And this, is a big point of disagreement between us. But in general, I would say there are changes that China wants to see to the international system. There are areas where they can go off on their own, and they have, and they probably would continue to do that, probably mostly in economic areas. But for the most part, they support the UN system and UN agreements. They like multilateralism. They want more multilateralism, not less. And they don't really, this is where I differ from some people in the Biden administration. They don't really want to be the leader of the international system. They don't want to be responsible for all of that. They are very focused on themselves, their own development. They're quite, in this respect, I would say, self-centered. And the worries about China sort of taking over the international system and leading it in a direction that we don't like, I think is pretty far-fetched.
Okay, great, thanks. I'll try to get in a couple more questions. We have one here that's asking about your assessment of the State Department's personnel when it comes to our capacity to both engage with China, as well as specifically in this question, engaging in identifying mutual interests of China's distrustful neighbors. So where's the State Department's capacity right now?
So Courtney, you may actually have a different view on this than I do. I don't think the State Department's problem is lack of resources. I think our problem is policy and politics. I think we, in our political system right now, devalue diplomacy, compromise, negotiations. This is probably a function of this unipolar period that I talked about, where we've sort of gotten used to throwing our weight around and being able to just be the demandeur and get what we want. Negotiations take a long time. It's incremental. It's not sexy. And, the agreements that you get after a negotiation are not, everything that you wanted usually, because usually a negotiation is a brokered compromise. So, we've really gone away from valuing diplomacy, in my view, in the United States. It's become kind of a proxy for weakness in our national character, and we see where it's gotten us. So I hope that diplomacy will come back in vogue. I think it's much more dependent on our political culture and the evolution of our politics than it is, training of personnel or resources or anything else. And unfortunately, given where we are at the moment, I think it's going to take quite a lot of time. But I hope that there will start to be, a demand signal among the American public to start, bringing back reasonable discussion with other countries and diplomacy, et cetera. I mean, we see that the Biden administration has gone a long way in reviving relations with our so-called partners and allies. They talk about that all the time, but it's pretty easy to do diplomacy with partners and allies. It's a lot harder to do it with, countries that don't agree with you or are not, on the same wavelength in terms of system or values. And, that's where the challenging part comes in. And I think we would profit by devoting a lot more effort and time to figuring out how to make progress with those elements.
Great. So to wrap it all up, what are specific steps that the U.S. administration and China can take now to try to lower tensions? What are some of the top things you'd like to see from either side?
Well, I think, it is important to be able to have meetings, official meetings between the U.S. and China without it becoming a political football every time. So the normalization of regular official meetings is crucially important. And without that, we have no idea really what they're thinking. They have really no idea what's going on with us. And it's a very dangerous escalatory security dilemma that will lead to conflict. So that's number one. I think that is, probably, unfortunately, far off. We've got an election cycle coming up, in November 2024. We'll have an election. Between now and then, it's going to be difficult. And after that, we don't know. So in the absence of constructive official discussions, I think it's really important that we try to keep up other connections. This is the most populous country in the world, the second largest economy. It's not going anywhere. We need to figure out how we're going to coexist with China. We're not going to defeat them. We're not going to overturn their, government. We're not going to invade them. It's just, my view, kind of nonsensical approach that we've embarked on. But we need to keep connections between people going. We need to keep connections between businesses going. And we need to, I think, try to find some areas in multilateral maybe talks where we can work together to solve some problems, because that's really the way that we're going to be able to sort of start to, reestablish these habits of working together and knowing what the other one is trying to do. And that really right now, I think that the, sort of big delta in understanding is really, really dangerous and damaging. And so any way we can try to close that while we wait for the powers that be to get together and talk big things is important.
All right. Well, on that note, I do hope to see your vision of understanding and no conflict prevail. So thank you for this. Thank you everyone for joining us. I just want to say I commend everyone for taking the time and the extra time to listen to this. I think it's really important. And please do share. We will have this on our YouTube channel after. So please feel free to share with friends and colleagues. I think the more we can have nuanced discussion around U.S. China relations, the better everything will be. So, Susan, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time and your vision. And thank you everyone for listening.
For more global insights or information on our Deep Dives China series, visit network2020.org and connect with us on YouTube and social media.